ladies, and thank you for joining us here at Her Theology. I am, as always, because I always say I'm excited about every topic, but I am excited about this topic. I'm excited because we're talking today about pregnancy and birth and what that process is like for women. Now, before I go any further and I explain where this is coming from, which is the book I've read, I do want to do a quick pause and acknowledge that there's some women listening to this that probably aren't pregnant or having kids. Maybe you're single, maybe you're past the age to have children, you've decided not to, or maybe that wasn't physically possible for you. And so this could be a touch point. It could be a sore point for some of you if you're struggling with grief over that. But for others of you that are going, this is not relevant because that's not where I'm at in my life, I would plead to you that maybe that's not the case. And I just want to share this really quick personal story as to why. So when I was in my 20s, my friend, she was my first friend on my group of friends that became pregnant. And she, at about 26, 28 weeks, found out she was breech. And she tried all the natural methods to move the baby around. And she was based here on the Central Coast. And I had no clue. I didn't know what any of this stuff meant at the time because I wasn't pregnant, didn't have kids myself. I was happily single at that time. And she was telling me how no one on the Central Coast provided the service to be able to deliver a breech baby naturally. And so she then went on this mission to push back on caregivers and to say, no, internationally, women give birth to breech babies naturally and with little complications. So why can't we do that here in Australia? And she found out there was not a lot of caregivers in this particular location that were experienced in that area. And so she searched around and ended up moving to Randwick for the week or two that she was due so that she could be with a obstetrician that was really qualified and experienced in giving breech natural births. And she did. She gave birth to her baby breech naturally. All was well and she went home. But what that taught me in my 20s is that women can advocate for the care that they need and that they can push back and ask questions, and that's not disrespectful. It's really healthy and wise, especially when it comes to our health and our baby's health. And that kind of put me on a trajectory that whenever I had friends going through pregnancy, I was able to support them by saying, you know, you can ask questions and you don't have to feel forced into anything. And so I'm saying all this to say maybe you're in your 20s or maybe you're in your 30s or 40s and you don't have kids and you're thinking this episode's not relevant. It is, because you could be, by listening to this episode, you could learn the skills and the tools and the techniques to be able to help other women that are in that journey, to support them, because it's actually a really tricky journey. It can be really scary at times with the unknowns. And with the right communication and the right knowledge, you can support women to be able to advocate for themselves and support them through that. So that way they conquer some of those fears and they can have a little bit more peace about their decisions. And so if you're listening and you're feeling like this is not relevant, maybe it is, give it a listen, share it with your friends and family. It might be really helpful. So I will now go into the episode. That was my little disclaimer. So that brings me right full back circle to this episode. So Bringing Forth Life is a book that I've just finished reading by Jodie MciVer. And am I pronouncing it right, Jodie?
Yeah, awesome. Perfect. Yeah. I'm not MacGyver like the handyman from the island. Yeah.
That would be fun though. Jodie is a registered midwife and graduate of Moore Theological College in Sydney, and she's also a wife and a mama. In this book, she pours through every aspect of the pregnancy journey, which I loved, from writing start at the beginning of birth and all the way through to the first stages of motherhood and everything in between with pregnancy. And she has a real God-centered approach in all that she discusses in the book. So she starts with the right biblical understanding of birth and then moves that into the practical advice on how to navigate the pregnancy journey, especially given all the unknowns and decision-making that is kind of thrown our way. She delicately handles the harsh realities of pregnancy and birth as well, including how to navigate the times when the worst does actually happen. And I just really enjoyed this book for so many reasons. One, because I'm a mum of 4 and it's very real for me, and I resonated with a lot of Jodie's points. But because Jodie really hits the mark on what it means to advocate for yourself and your baby and what it looks like to trust God through that entire process. And she's not scared to push back on the medical industry, at the same time acknowledging that it's there and it's good for a reason. And so what does that look like, venturing that path and holding all those different thoughts in competing that seem to be competing at times with wisdom and grace. And so Jodie, thanks for coming on the episode and talking about your book and talking about this topic.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me along. I love talking about this topic, so it's a great joy for me.
That's great. So maybe you could start off by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I became a midwife quite young, well before having my own children, and I worked full time in a big, busy hospital, and that had its joys, but also plenty of hard parts.
Sure.
And I was also dating my husband, who was a minister, and I was sort of looking ahead to maybe entering into a life of ministry too. And so after that first year of being a midwife, I actually resigned my job and decided to go and study at Bible college for a few years, which I did, and that was great. And yeah, when we got married, we loved working in ministry alongside each other. And I sort of thought I was never going to go back to midwifery at that point. I thought this was a new stage, but I did just keep my hand in it with a few casual shifts. And it was sort of only really once I had my own children and went through the experience, I guess, from the other side, and seeing what that whole transition was like, that I just suddenly realized that there was a real lack of Christian resources on the topic. Yeah. So just these are massive experiences for women and for men and for families. And just why aren't we really thinking more deeply about this and about the bigger picture? Because I also saw how central, I guess, birth is in the Bible story as well. And so, yeah, that was when I started to think, I think we need to, think more deeply about this topic. And yeah, then that kind of dawned on me that maybe I should do something about that. And yeah, that's kind of how the book eventually, many years later, came about, once I'd gone through the baby toddler stage, all that.
I love that. And I think it's great. It's a great also testimony to that you can do what God's calling you to do, even in the midst of the craziness of motherhood. To write a book with 3 little ones, even though it may not have been toddler phase, it's still little kids, is a tremendous effort. So
yeah, absolutely. And I should say I had support from ADM, Anglican Deaconess Ministries, who enabled me to spend a whole year, 2 days a week, kind of focused on this project. So that really made it possible too.
It's awesome, isn't it? It's a great ministry what they do there. So good.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess you touched on it a little bit just then, and I'd love to explore it a little bit further. You start your book looking at the theological aspect of birth, how birth is interwoven all throughout Scripture. We see that language, metaphor, narrative used throughout. So I thought maybe you could just invite our listeners into that a little bit, and how we see that birth play out right at the beginning and woven through Scripture.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you ask people to think about birth in the Bible, there's probably 2 things that immediately jump to mind. One is kind of the story of Genesis 3, and the other is Jesus' birth.
Yep.
But actually, there's so much more. There's hundreds of mentions. I think the way that I like to think about it is the Bible itself as a bit of a birth story, because what we see at the very center of the Bible story is the cross, the gospel, however you want to phrase it, the Easter story, where Jesus suffers and dies and rises again to give new life. Or, as the Bible often speaks about it, and in John's letters in particular, to give new birth as children of God. And so that kind of ultimate act of pain and suffering to bring life is at the center of the Bible story. And that is, I think, a picture, and it's the metaphors used there, that it's a new birth. And so everything leading up to that, there's a whole lot of stories of birth in the Bible. You see all these couples dealing with infertility for lots of reasons, and God brings miraculous births of children who go on to shape the course of history. But all that's kind of leading up to, it's a bit like the pregnancy, all that time of waiting and leading towards this new birth, which is not the birth of Jesus into our world, though that's part of his labor to give us new life, but actually what he achieves for us on the cross and in his resurrection. And then out of that, as children of God and as a new community of people formed through God's work of new birth, then there's that ongoing story of the growth of the church. And so I feel like in a way it kind of mirrors the birth story. And I think that's no coincidence that God has chosen these kind of very human experiences to explain something of the wonder of his work and character in the world. And yeah, I think that gives our human experiences great honor as they kind of point towards that greater reality of pain and hard work to bring life into the world.
Yeah, and I love that you touched on that in Genesis with the curse, and maybe we can explore that a little bit, because I think a lot of women, a lot of women are like, oh, yeah, childbearing is going to be, birth is going to be painful. It's part of the curse. But I have seen an increase in women influencers. I don't know if they're qualified or anything, but Christian influencers that are saying you can have pain-free childbirth just by proclaiming it and believing in it and having faith, which I think personally is very misleading and can do quite a lot of spiritual damage. But what I really liked is the way you described how God kind of redeems that curse through that the death brings forth life. Could you expand on that a little bit more? Because I thought you did a really beautiful job of that in the book, how we can kind of use that to, I guess, realign our thinking about what that curse means and how God's using that for our own edification purpose.
Yeah, I think it's easy for us, and I probably felt like this a bit myself as well, to think that childbirth itself, or womanhood even, is a curse in some way. But the picture we see in Genesis 3 is God has always been the life giver, the ultimate life giver, and he brings life into the world. And he enables us to share in that in different ways, in the whole working the ground and farming, and in we also give birth, and there's many other ways in which we nurture life in the world too. But at that, the reality that people turn away from God and are separated from his life-giving power in some way, and obviously everything kind of falls apart in many ways as a result of the way that we have rejected God. That leads to the reality that while bringing life into the world is still good and important and wonderful, now it's really hard. And that's true of the thorns and thistles as we work the ground. And it's true not just of the contractions of labor, though that, is often, like you said, very painful. But it's the whole picture. There's pain and struggle in conception. There's pain and struggle often in breastfeeding, in parenting. I mean, it's a bigger picture that the reality of life-giving in a broken world is that it's painful, and that's true for God as well as us. We see, like in Genesis 6:6, it says God's heart was deeply troubled by what had happened with his relationship with humanity, and bringing life is painful for him ultimately in being God with us, in Jesus coming into the world and going through that pain in order to bring us life. So that's kind of a long answer.
That's great.
But the reality of bringing forth life is that it's painful, but that doesn't make it less good or important or valuable. And in fact, we see that God works through pain and hardship and even death to bring forth life in different ways.
Yeah. And that's what I loved about it when I was reading a book. I thought, this is a beautiful way to kind of fight back for the yes, there's going to be suffering in life, and this is just another part of that that's going to bring us closer to God, and we can see his goodness in it. Like you said, that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It's still a good thing. Um, jumping jumping on now to the actual, I guess, history behind birth and how we've changed as a society. You mentioned in there we're the first generation to not really experience birth firsthand, and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. I hadn't considered that. You know that, yeah. My Oma, my grandma, she saw her mum give birth, and it was very normal for children and family members to be present in birth, or to have, it was more common to have home births if all was well. Yes, that came with its own risk and implications, but it was an interesting thought. It really challenged me to think, okay, yeah, birth was very foreign to me entering it. It wasn't a normal thing in my life. I didn't really know what to expect. It's very clinical was my understanding of it. So I guess maybe you could explain how that has, as Christian women as well, influenced our mindset. So we've got that, whole idea and concept of the curse, and it's painful. And then also this kind of gap in our generations where birth doesn't seem natural anymore. It seems like that's handed to the medical complex. So maybe you could flesh that out a little bit. I'm not sure what I want you to say,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
like flesh it
Well,
out
we'll
and
see
how
how we
that
go.
impacts us.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think definitely one of the first generations. Most of us haven't any experience of birth firsthand, or even kind of seeing it happen remotely. Like, for me, actually, I was privileged to be present for the birth of my younger brother and sister when I was just a kid. And so I think that does normalize the process somewhat. So for many women today, we hear stories from people, and they can obviously be a mixture of wonderful and often terrifying stories. And we may watch, birth in movies where it's ridiculously over dramatized because they have to get it done in 1 or 2 minutes, when that's not the reality. But yeah, we come into the whole experience often not knowing very much, and therefore often, I think, having a real fear associated with birth, and also an expectation that if we haven't done it and we haven't seen anyone do it, maybe it's something that someone else just does to us. That idea of a midwife or a doctor delivering a baby, when the reality is that's basically standing around watching, and making sure all's going smoothly. But yeah, I think many women who've actually just seen women give birth and seen what it can be like, that can build that sort of confidence in understanding that your body can do this too. You don't even have to learn a whole lot of stuff or know exactly what's happening, but your body can do this in most circumstances without too much difficulty. And there's obviously a whole nother big picture there of the medicalization of birth in our current society, and the good and the bad that's come with that. But yeah, I think it's foreign, it's strange, and it's scary for many people. When certainly, yeah, for me, having seen my mum give birth twice, it had a different feeling, I guess. For me, it was something that I could do, that would happen, and just part of that kind of parenting family journey.
So do you think we've kind of lost touch? Like, why has that happened? Why do you think there is such a gap now?
Well, that's a long story, I reckon. But the so yeah, if we look throughout history, like, birth was kind of the women's domain in the past, and it was something shared with your close family members. The females in your family or community would come to support you, and when that kind of changed to going to hospital to give birth, there were good reasons for that, although it didn't result in better outcomes initially, because there was those high rates of infection caused by caregivers in hospitals. So that and that's kind of shaped the culture then on. Most women today go to hospital, and in hospitals we can access lots of emergency care that's required in some cases. However, the normalization of that medical model of birth, I guess, has also led to a normalization of intervention in birth. And that was partly because hospitals, run on efficiency and doctors and matrons and all that, like things had to fit into a time frame. And so if it wasn't happening that way, then we'll get in there, we'll make it happen one way or another. So I guess that's only just touching on the history of birth, but there's certainly an expectation now that like more than 50% of healthy first-time mothers in Australia have their labours induced for various reasons, and some of them good reasons, but certainly not that kind of number. And then that leads on to other interventions and things because your body isn't following its physiological path. Yeah. And so it's all kind of perpetuates that expectation that we need help to give birth. And in some cases we absolutely do, but we're now intervening just because there's a risk of needing something done. And so we're actually intervening before the need in many cases, I guess.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing, right? When I was reading it and thinking it through, I was like, I wonder as well, like I've always understood it that a lot of the times hospitals have litigation in the back of their head. So we can't be sued. So if we follow this protocol, we could prevent that. I don't know if that's accurate or not.
Yeah, I work in the public system, and there is a bit of a fear culture, and obviously that varies between individuals, but there is always a fear of, well, if I didn't do anything and something went wrong, even if there was no cause of that, then I guess doctors particularly want to feel like they've done anything that could help even before it might be needed, and that's why we're just proliferating. Yeah. And we're all guilty of that to varying extents in the health system, I think.
Oh, you there? Okay, you come back. Sorry, I lost you for a second there.
I'm here.
So what about, so I'm curious as well if this plays a little bit into it, that we're seeing an increase in, I guess, a clinical maybe approach. Is that the right way of saying it? Like of birth, where it stays in the realm of the medical versus this natural process that our body is built for. I wonder if part of it is linked to also what we were touching on, that we want to escape suffering. We don't want to go through the hardship. So it seems like if we're in the medical world, in the medical complex, when I say like we're birthing in a hospital or something like that, we feel like there's more safety of preventing suffering or any uncomfortableness during the birth process. And so then that increases the need for medical interventions and whatnot. It's just interesting thinking about it in light of our society where we're about instant gratification and we want to be comfortable. And as Christian women, that's actually quite challenging to think about when it comes to pregnancy and birth, because I think God calls us to be uncomfortable and to endure suffering for a good reason.
Yeah, I think a big part of it is that kind of feeling a desire to remain in control. I think especially as we've kind of pushed the age of childbearing later and later, we're used to being in control of our lives and our bodies, and pregnancy even before birth is sort of a big change in that regard. And we suddenly for men as well as women, we worry for the health of the baby in our body, but we can't really do much about that. And there's that kind of loss of control. And then birth is kind of uniquely an experience of your body taking over. And there's a degree of loss of control in that, in allowing your body to do all its hormonal things and give life to your baby that is somewhat foreign and somewhat uncomfortable. And sometimes people feel that by maybe being able to control the timing of their birth or other things, that they'll be able to maintain that control. But sadly, in many cases, things can still go wrong. And in fact, you're much more likely to have a big bleed or something after a cesarean or other interventions. So we can kind of try and hold on to that control. But the reality of pregnancy and birth, but of life in general, is that we're not totally in control, and we still need to make careful and wise decisions and not put our heads in the sand. But yeah, it's an experience of learning, I think, to trust God when we're not fully in control, because for some that may be kind of the first time they've really felt that experience, and that we can't make things happen exactly the way we want them to necessarily, and God is in control, so that can be really reassuring.
Oh, hang on, I've lost you again. What's happening?
Yeah, sorry. I lost you that time.
Yes, say that sentence again. So God is in control. Not the whole sentence, that last little bit, sorry. It's gone now.
I can't remember exact words, so I'm happy to say something, but it might be different.
Just something along the lines of like, it might be the first time that women experience.
Yeah, so this is an experience, and sometimes for the first time, of actually not being in control of our bodies and of what's happening necessarily. And it can be an experience of growth in that, of actually learning what it is to trust God in a situation where we're no longer fully in control.
No, I really love that you touched on that with in control. That's a really good way to go into this next question that I have, which is, are we playing God too much? You touch in the book on decision making and how that can be really tricky territory to tread, because there's legitimate reasons to be concerned, and then there's things that we just do as a precautionary test or examination or intervention. And so how do we tread that course? And anyway, it made me think, are we playing God too much in the process of pregnancy, because there is so much at our disposal that is an intervention? So maybe we could explore, what does that look like for women to trust God and still utilize the tools that have been presented to her?
Yeah, sure. I mean, healthcare is a wonderful thing, and when it enables us to treat or prevent illness or death, then that's obviously always been the purpose of healthcare historically. However, there are some areas in which that has shifted a little, as we'll all be aware of now with VAD, voluntary assisted dying, and also in the sphere of pregnancy, prenatal genetic testing in pregnancy. So these kind of tests, such as the nuchal translucency, or you might have heard now of the NIPT, non-invasive prenatal testing, or the invasive things like amniocentesis. These have all been brought in to enable us to know about genetic conditions, chromosomal abnormalities in our baby before they're born. And sadly, that's not with any view to being able to treat these conditions, because they're untreatable thus far. But that's with a view to enabling women and couples to choose to terminate their pregnancy.
Can I just
if they want?
Interject for a second. I'm aware some listeners might not know what you're talking about. Do you want to explain what those tests are for exactly?
Yeah, sure. So it's become very routine now that all women are offered prenatal genetic testing during usually at the end of their first trimester. So that has been something called a nuchal translucency ultrasound and blood tests, where they measure various attributes of the fetus, particularly the back of the neck fold, the nuchal fold, and nasal bone, other things, to determine the chance that their baby might have Down syndrome or a couple of other chromosomal abnormalities. We also more recently have a more accurate screening test, which has been brought in, which is called non-invasive prenatal testing, which just takes the mother's blood and can give a more accurate representation of whether this pregnancy is affected. And so these things are just completely normalized as a routine part of pregnancy care for most women, even before they go to the hospital or any of this is through the GP. And these tests are not with a view to being able to help the baby in any way, because that's not possible with chromosomal conditions, but they're with a view to women and couples being able to decide whether they want to continue the pregnancy or whether they would like, sadly, to terminate the pregnancy based on their findings. So this is something that not everyone's aware of, I think, when they undertake these tests, because it's often just kind of you're given the form, you go off, you get it done. But actually there are big implications for this in thinking through, well, what will you do differently if you find out this information? Some of the tests are not very accurate, particularly the nuchal translucency just gives you a risk value, which is not that helpful, because even a high risk result is often only 1 in 100 or something like that. And then you have to go on to either consider more accurate options, which are invasive and carry a risk to the baby, or these days the expensive option of the non-invasive prenatal testing doesn't give you a definite result, but it's very accurate now. So yeah, this is kind of the nature of pregnancy today, and it does change the experience. If you have these tests, and there's always waiting for the next result and the worry that comes with that, and it's just a different model of health care, I guess, to other things like the more routine mid-pregnancy ultrasound, where they look at all the parts of the baby and make sure that everything looks okay. There are reasons for doing that which might change what you do afterwards. If your placenta's covering the cervix, then you might opt for a cesarean birth, things like that are very practical. Whereas the genetic screening is very much a thinking through whether we want to continue these pregnancies. And sadly, about more than 90% of babies with Down syndrome in Australia never are born. So that's a really present reality.
It's actually a horrifying stat. And I think as Christian women, you might struggle hearing that, but I want to push back to listeners. You need to seriously weigh in and consider where you stand on the pro-choice, pro-life debate. For me, it's very clear-cut. I have done an episode on that called Abortion, Grace and Truth, which I talk extensively about abortion, what it is, what it isn't, all that sort of stuff. And understanding that what we're discussing is a form of abortion. It's not a medical termination, which is a different situation when someone has an ectopic pregnancy and that baby is not going to survive. This is a very different situation where we are playing God and we're saying, oh, there's a chance of Down syndrome or another abnormality. I can never say it. And therefore we need to terminate. And I think the medical complex is very easy to hand that out as well. I think I read one of your statements that a doctor said to one of the women that you knew that you shared about in the book that, some women will just get it fixed and cleared out and start again. And I just broke my heart. I was like, that's just disgraceful attitude towards life. But that is the reality of what you will face as you become pregnant and you go through the medical industry. That not everyone shares the same values. And so you and your partner, your husband, need to come to a conclusion before you do these tests. Is there any point in doing the test? Is probably a big question if you would never terminate. And if you do the test and it comes back with something, what does that mean for you? And what anxiety can that give you? And is that something that's going to test your faith in a good way? Or are you able to just walk faithfully with God in your pregnancy and know that whatever happens and he's sovereign? And so these are big topics and they're hard topics, but I think I love that your book pushed into it and leaned into it because no one really talks about it. It's not often talked about and discussed. And for me personally, we didn't do the tests. I took the ultrasound with my first son and I didn't do the blood test, and the manager of the ultrasound place rang me And she was like, you need to go get the blood test done. I was like, oh, I'm not doing it. I just wanted to see my baby on the ultrasound. I'm not interested in the results. And she rang me twice and hounded me. And then another manager rang me and apologized a week later. Was like, I'm so sorry. She shouldn't have done that. She shouldn't have said that. She shouldn't have told you it's your choice. You can't be forced to do a blood test. I'm like, no, I'm well aware of that. Thank you. But it was really foreign for them. They just could not comprehend that I did not want that test done. And so that is the pressure that you could potentially face if you decide not to go down that route. Not everyone, but there is that. So I thought I'd share that for women that are listening.
Yeah, that's right. I think we can often have very different worldviews to our caregivers. And so it's important that we're making the decisions ourselves, because this is our baby and this is our experience of pregnancy, and everything is offered to us, but it's a genuine offer, and people will accept, what you want to take on and what you don't want to take on. And even if you're at high risk for being an older woman or for having, whatever medical history, you absolutely can make these decisions yourself with your partner.
And I found it was a really good opportunity to share the gospel. People couldn't quite understand why. And so I was able to explain, well, we're Christians and we believe in life. And, don't be afraid of those tough conversations with caregivers at times, because there actually is an opportunity to share why you believe what you believe. And it's quite powerful at times. So we've talked about how we can make the decision-making process throughout pregnancy and what that looks like for us, especially as Christian women, and the ethics, I guess. There's a lot of ethics to consider in light of with a biblical worldview, like to understand every decision we make will impact somehow our life and our child and us. And so what's the right way to do that biblically? And I think that's a case by case, right? Every woman has a different journey. We're not giving you a blanket answer. But can you maybe discuss and flesh out for us what advocacy looks like? And I ask this question because I've come alongside quite a few friends and family members that are going through pregnancy and birth, and they find advocacy really hard because as Christians, I don't know if you ever listened to Vodi Borkum, he has a saying, he goes, the 11th commandment, thou ought to be nice. And talks about how we as Christians have fallen into the trap that we think we need to be nice over being, pursuers of truth. And he's not saying you be mean and nasty.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that slides into us for our journey in pregnancy and birth or anything medically, is that we feel like pushing back and asking questions like why, or where's the data, or what's the other options. We feel like we're being rude. And sometimes as Christian women, we can struggle with that, right? Because we need to be pleasant and nice. We don't want to seem off-putting to others. And so I guess, how do women navigate advocating for themselves? Like, what does that look like, advocating for themselves? And how do we do it in a way that we still honor God, but we actually are standing, pursuing truth in light of what's best for ourselves and our bodies and our babies versus just what the medical world is saying is right?
Yeah, well, look, I think it's a really important choice initially that women have when they very first find out that they're pregnant, as to what kind of care they want to have for this pregnancy and birth. And so there's many options, ranging from kind of a private midwife, potentially with a home birth, through the public system and the various levels of care that offers, whether you're well, or whether it's a complex pregnancy in some way, through to a private hospital system and choosing an obstetrician to provide care at birth. And so it's really worth making that decision, I guess, based on what your hopes for the birth are, rather than just what, people around you have done, or what your health insurance status would lead you to do, or whatever. Because that ultimately will set the shape of the whole experience then on, depending on if you share similar ideals to what your health provider does. But that being said, you may not have many options financially or whatever, or geographically. And so whoever's providing your care, along the way, absolutely, you want to understand why things are being suggested to you, and you can request a second opinion at any point, even in the public system. Absolutely can request a second opinion or request to see the evidence or the statistics for whatever's being discussed. And that might sometimes put people aback, but that's okay. That's their job. Like, as our actual job is to obtain informed consent from women for anything that's going to happen. And so we do the informing. It should be a balanced informing of the pros and cons of one option versus the pros and cons of the other. It's not always.
No.
It's often rushed. It's often so. So absolutely say, I want to think about this and talk about it again in a week's time or whatever, depending on the circumstances. But even if your health provider thinks you should do something, you don't have to. And that's ultimately your decision. And as a midwife or as a doctor, we just need to make sure we've explained everything to you and that you've made a clear decision based on that. And then you shouldn't be hounded afterwards. But sadly, your experience isn't unique in that. In labour or situations like that, advocacy can be really important for someone else, whether that's your partner, your husband, or someone else who's there with you, because you're often not in a mental state to weigh up all the options and decisions. And really, in labour, you're just wanting to zone out and let your body do its thing.
Absolutely.
So that can be a real challenge, and which is why it's really helpful if you can trust your caregiver before that, or if you can make sure your partner or whoever's supporting you has a clear understanding. And there's always the option to say, well, what if we don't? What if we don't do that? What would happen? But most of these big decisions aren't kind of in the heat of the moment in labour. It's often in those final weeks of pregnancy. If you have an ultrasound and the baby looks to be a bit bigger, then there might be suggestions about induction of labour. And again, you can look at the evidence and you can weigh up the risks of continuing the pregnancy versus the risks of induction, and they're very real as well. And we don't always do well at explaining the risks of the intervention proposed as well as the risks of just continuing the pregnancy. So yeah, it's a good educational experience for your midwife or your doctor if you say, well, why are you suggesting this? Well, how many women will this actually affect? And, you should be able to get numbers like sometimes things they'll say it's a tripled risk, and it goes from 1 in 100,000 to 3 in 100,000. So it's true. It's a tripled risk, but it's still a very low objective risk. So it's all those things to think through. And it's really hard. Like, it's easy for me to say as a midwife, but when you're coming into this without a background in health, it can feel totally overwhelming and daunting, and it seems easier to just do what someone tells you. But sadly, there are many cases in which practice isn't always evidence-based. It can be based, like you said earlier, sort of on that culture of fear and things. And it's really, it's a really significant experience, the birth one, for you as you become a mother, as you become parents. And so it can have big implications. And like you, many of us, do sadly experience trauma in that. And that's not, that's obviously we can move through that and we can get on, but imagine how wonderful it would have been to avoid it in the first place. So yeah.
There was an interesting stat you had in your book when it came to birth trauma, actually, which was 2/3 of a research study done with women that had birth trauma was actually not from the birth itself, but actually from their experience with the caregiver. So, I mean, that was quite shocking to read that.
2/3 of the psychological trauma is related to the actions or inactions and interactions with caregivers. So it's birth trauma isn't always about something went wrong and there was an emergency, but it's often the way that we are treated as women, way we feel respected or not, and whether we feel like we are able to make decisions and have autonomy over our bodies in what's such a vulnerable and for many women scary time. Those things can make a huge difference to our experience, regardless of whether it was a straightforward birth, or whether it was a more medical birth like a cesarean or something. Both of those can still be wonderful experiences. Absolutely. Or both of those can still be highly traumatic, depending on the relationship between you and those around you at the time.
And I can resonate with that on a personal level, that my firstborn was born with after 12 hours of labour, emergency C-section. And I had more significant trauma over that because I felt like I lost my autonomy in that moment, particularly with some of the things that happened on the theatre bed. And versus my daughter, where I had a 3C tear, which is probably way too much information for a podcast, but there it is.
It's all right. Some people might not know exactly what it means. So.
I will not go into the detail.
Nasty tear. Yeah.
Not a nice tear. But still, I would count it as a successful VBAC. And even though I opted for forceps, and it was the wrong thing to do, but I opted in it, and it gave me the 3C tear. In hindsight, I had less trauma around it because it was my decision. And even though it didn't go completely as I planned, she was healthy and fine, so I can't complain. But I had less trauma over that, even though physically there was a lot more long-term implications that came from that. And I think that was largely because I felt like I finally had my autonomy back, that I made those decisions, I made those calls, and I was respected for that. And so, yeah, I think what you're saying there about autonomy is such a powerful part of preventing that birth trauma as well. And like you said, it's not always going to go to plan. And there are times where there are serious emergencies and medical intervention just needs to happen to save lives. And that's a good thing. I'm not complaining about that. But understanding as Christian women that you have autonomy, God's given you this. And God, I truly believe God gives us that gut instinct to know what's right for our body often. Not always, but I think there is that. And I think we need to stop second guessing that sometimes. I don't know. I don't know if there's any biblical grounds for that. I don't know. Maybe you can put your 2 cents in on that. But I do feel a sense of, as you enter motherhood, even in pregnancy and birth, you do get this innate mum gut that starts happening and taking place. And I think we don't talk about it and we don't give it enough credit. And I think if we are going into it thinking of that and praying through that and asking the Holy Spirit to give us discernment in those moments, I do believe God is quite faithful in giving us peace. Even when something maybe might be out of control and be against what we wanted, He can still give us peace because we can know that we're going with Him in what we think is right. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think with all of this, like many women, when things don't go how they hoped, can feel that sense of failure.
Yes.
And people will even articulate it like that they've failed in some way. Whereas I think it's helpful if we think, whatever happens, and even if we have been disrespected or like bad stuff has happened, there's still that absolute sense that all this hardness or suffering is we're bearing that to bring life to our child. And so it's still a really good, wonderful thing that you're doing. That shouldn't have happened to you. And there's a real tragedy in that. But this is all part of the painful labor with which we bring forth children, not necessarily literally labor, but the pain and the hard work that's involved. And even if we've kind of had the works, and that shouldn't feel like a failure. It may be a failure of the system and they've let you down, but it's not. You've done what you had to give life to your baby. And in cases where that's been harder than for most, then that's all the more beautiful picture of kind of sacrificial life giving that you've really borne the cost
Yes.
of bringing forth life, and that's reflecting how Jesus has borne the cost for you of giving new birth.
Yeah, and you touch on it in the book as well, how our bodies are then a representation of that, the scars we carry and the way our body changes, and it does not go back to how it was. They're all beautiful little reminders of what it means to bring forth life and what a gift that is. It's actually really beautiful. You constantly go back to that in the book, and it's a really great reminder. So I guess before we wrap up, maybe we can touch a little bit on motherhood, because we're talking about pregnancy and birth, but that's just the on-ramp roller coaster that gets you into the next whirlwind adventure, which is a phenomenal adventure. I love it dearly. But yeah, maybe we could talk about what, is it good to put all our focus and our emphasis on the pregnancy and the birth bit? Or do you think maybe we're not putting enough emphasis and education and awareness around the next section, which is the motherhood part?
I think it's a bit unavoidable that our focus often tends toward that moment of birth. That's kind of the climax of the pregnancy and when it's all going to change. And that's okay. I mean, in lots of ways, I think with pregnancy, birth, and particularly with new motherhood, you kind of find your feet as you go.
Absolutely.
Like, this is an experience of growth and learning. It's not something you need to study up for necessarily, but you will get to know. That's right. You'll get to know your baby as you spend time together and learn their needs and learn how you can provide for them. And it's absolutely a whirlwind kind of total chaos experience for many women. But I don't know that thinking about that so far in advance is necessarily going to help. But I mean, there are some, like, I think getting a basic understanding, if you're planning to breastfeed, of what that looks like and how that works can be helpful while you're still pregnant. Making sure you have support systems in place, like if you start to struggle with your mental health or anything, like what can you do? Who could you reach out to in those situations? Or and just kind of coordinating that. Hopefully you have some degree of village of support for you as new parents. That's all wonderful. But yeah, I think birth feels like a big deal. So it's okay if you think about that. It's not quite that wedding and marriage illustration. It doesn't fit in quite the same way.
No.
But yeah, becoming a mother and becoming a parent more generally is absolutely in continuity with the experience of pregnancy and birth. It's sort of like you said, it's leading you into it. It's still an experience of the pain of bringing forth life, the sleeplessness, the everything. Like it's full of joy, but a lot of the joy and the goodness of it is through the hardness of it, because it really does humble us. It really is an experience of suddenly feeling brand new at something, when maybe you've become a very accomplished in your career and you're used to being kind of at the top of your game, and this is suddenly you're a novice. And so it's a time of great spiritual work. I think God is at work in us, and it's through that experience of loss and of kind of change and of feeling inadequate or whatever it is, that God brings forth life in us as well as our babies, in terms of that spiritual growth and transformation in his image, in learning in such a visceral way what it is to give up parts of your own life and self for the nourishment and nurture of this other person who you don't even know. Like, it's that real one of other, but a significant experience of selfless kind of love that's very action-based, and that really has a cost. And it's through that we are changed and transformed. And for men, I think, even if, for example, if a woman's breastfeeding and you might feel like a little bit on the outer, just that that loving care for her as she cares for the baby, like, is absolutely well, A, essential, but B, also transformative for you as you experience the cost of bringing forth life in a new way, to when you're just adults kind of working together. Suddenly there's this little person that needs so much of you, and it's a really big transition, and we can feel like it's mundane, like it's just, changing and feeding and washing dishes and all this, but that is the actual work of life giving at this point, and it's not insignificant, and through this, God is absolutely at work doing powerful things in you, as well as you give life to your baby.
And I feel like motherhood, particularly those early years, just has taught me so much about grace and God's grace for me that, life changes so significantly. Gone are my quiet times where I could sit down for an hour and a half and read the Bible. Now it looks like quick 10 minutes before I get interrupted. But those life just changes, and God's grace is so sufficient, and he meets you there, and it's just really beautiful to see how it's a very refining fire. And I think of Paul when he says, women will be saved through childbearing, through hope, love, and what is it? Hope. Anyway, and I just think a lot of people misinterpret that text to talk about salvation. That's not what he's insinuating. He's actually saying there's a refining fire that takes place through childbearing. And when I say childbearing, not just labor, the whole process of motherhood.
Absolutely.
And Paul says it's a wonderful gift for those that are able to experience it. And we need to appreciate it, even in the midst of the tiredness and the crankiness and the exhaustion that can take place. I just want to touch on really quickly as well one more thing. How can we support our sisters that struggle with postnatal depression, particularly women that are believers in Jesus? Because I know some women struggle with that, and they can go very silent and isolate, and there can be a lot of shame and guilt, even though that shouldn't be the case. But I know they can feel that and sense that within themselves. So how would you advise us to help women to be aware of that within themselves, but also to support others that might be struggling with that?
Yeah, it's a tricky one often when we're in that zone, because just to work out what's going on, because there's normal emotional changes that come, particularly that really early kind of day 4 baby blues stage. But even in an ongoing way, like it's okay to feel sad about the things that have changed and the things that you've lost, and that everything might not be as you hoped. And so that can be just a normal part of the motherhood experience. But then, of course, there is a significant number of women for whom that kind of normal physiological adjustment is exacerbated in some way, and we don't always understand why that is. And it can be a significant anxiety or depression that people fall into, or even in the most extreme cases, there's postnatal psychosis, in fact, that is triggered in some way through these experiences. And so I feel like at any point, it's always good to get additional support. Like if someone's like, I don't know if this is really depression or if it's just I'm finding it hard to adjust, finding someone to talk to is it's not going to cause any harm. And I hope that stigma is dissipating a little bit, and I think it is. But still, it's hard for all of us to reach out and say we need help, or and so encouraging people to feel comfortable to do that, even if it doesn't necessarily mean it's some mental illness as such, but just getting help, talking things through, whether that's with a family member or trusted Christian friend or whatever, or whether it's with a professional of some kind. Getting help early is always going to help. It's hard that help isn't always easily accessible. But generally in the postnatal period, there are additional helplines and things you can call. So even if you don't have money to pay for a psychologist or anything like that, there are helplines who can connect you in to support wherever you are, whenever you are, whatever time of the day or night. So that's really wonderful that those resources are there. But yeah, being open with those around you, not everyone around you, but your closest circle as to how you're going and how you're feeling. And it's okay to need that kind of extra love and support and care in what is a really challenging period. And it's not enough that your baby's healthy, you should be okay. That's not the reality. The reality is that this is a massive change to your identity and lifestyle and everything, and it's hard for everyone. And for some, they also need extra special care to help them through this period, and that's totally just life. We're all different. And God works in our lives through the love and the care of the people around us. So I think by opening ourselves up to others to support us, we're actually enabling them to support and to bear our load, and to actually love like Jesus loves. So that's great.
Yeah. And your time will come. You'll be able to do it to someone else one day. Accept it while you can. Yeah. That's the beauty of the church community. Oh, I've lost you again. Oh, there you go. You're back again.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You've come back
I don't know
now.
why it's doing that. Well,
I don't know. It could maybe it's my internet or something.
I don't know. Anyway. Well, that was very insightful. I still have more questions, but that's okay. It's such a big topic to go down. But look, for anyone that's listening, if you are pregnant, maybe you're trying to be pregnant, or maybe you know someone that's pregnant, I would highly recommend this book as a resource, as a pregnancy gift. It doesn't matter how far along or how early they are in the journey. I would really recommend it. It's just really helpful, very practical. Jodie goes through all the different options you have. She actually lays out, the medical. She explains a lot of the medical jargon and interventions and options there are for you. So it's just practical. It's helpful. And yeah, I recommend it. You can get it online at most of the bookstore retailers, as far as I can see. I got mine from Reformers Bookstore.
And it's also an ebook on Apple or Kindle too.
Oh, it is? Okay, there you go. Good stuff.
Yeah.
You're going to do audio?
Hopefully. Yeah, hopefully, but not yet.
Sit down and talk for ages into a microphone?
Totally.
Well, Jodie, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been a massive blessing, and I commend you for your work. It's great.
Thanks so much for having me on, Cass. It's been great to talk to you.